The grand chandelier glittered above the mansion's marble hall, its light bouncing across walls lined with gold-framed portraits. But beneath all the luxury, a chilling silence was broken by the sound of suffering. A maid stood trembling, her cheek pressed beneath the sharp hand of the billionaire's wife, whose rage burned brighter than her sparkling red dress. Gasps filled the room as guests froze in disbelief. The maid, though humiliated, whispered nothing more than obedience. Yet behind her eyes was a storm no one could see, a storm waiting for the right moment to break free. What none of them knew was that this mansion, built on wealth and power, was about to become the stage for an unforgettable battle of dignity against cruelty. A new maid would soon arrive, someone unexpected, someone who would change everything. And when she did, the walls of silence that had protected the wife's reign for so long would begin to crumble. But how could a simple maid dare to challenge the woman everyone feared, and how could she do the impossible in a house where no one ever won? The mansion stood like a fortress of elegance, perched high above the city with gates taller than most houses and guards that kept unwanted eyes away. Inside, the halls echoed with wealth, golden staircases, velvet carpets, and chandeliers that never stopped glowing. To outsiders, it looked like a palace of dreams. To those inside, it was a prison of silence. At the heart of this empire was the billionaire's wife. She was known in society for her beauty, her extravagant gowns, and her commanding presence at galas. People admired her confidence, but those who worked for her knew a very different side, a side sharp as glass, where kindness was replaced by control and appearances mattered more than people. Among the staff was a maid who had served the family longer than most. She was soft-spoken, diligent, and loyal, always moving quietly through the halls with a duster in hand or a tray balanced perfectly. Her dedication never faltered, even when whispers of her mistreatment spread among the other workers. For years, she had endured harsh orders, icy glares, and the weight of invisible chains, believing that silence was the price of survival. The days inside the mansion followed a rhythm that felt unbreakable. Mornings began before dawn, when the staff hurried through the grand corridors, polishing silver, preparing lavish breakfasts, and ensuring the house sparkled as if no one had ever lived in it. And in the center of this endless routine was the maid who had served the longest, moving quietly, her uniform crisp, her steps soft against the marble floors. She worked tirelessly, but no effort ever seemed enough. A smudge on a glass, a wrinkle. In a tablecloth, even a shadow of hesitation was met with cold disapproval. The billionaire's wife found fault in everything, her sharp eyes scanning like a hawk circling prey. And when she spoke, her words carried not instruction but condemnation, echoing through the hall like a reminder that perfection was demanded, but never rewarded. The other workers watched in silence. They noticed how the maid's hands had begun to stiffen from years of scrubbing, how her shoulders drooped under invisible weight, and how her face carried a quiet sadness that never left. They whispered among themselves about the unfairness, but whispers never left the kitchen. For in this mansion, silence was safer than truth. Guests who visited never saw the suffering behind the glittering walls. They complimented the wife's beauty, admired her parties, and marveled at the flawless service. But they never noticed the trembling hands that poured their wine or the tired eyes that lowered whenever the wife swept into the room. And through it all, the maid endured. She swallowed the pain of every harsh order and carried it like a secret burden. What kept her going was not the mansion itself, but the thought of the family she supported outside its gates. Each coin she earned was a lifeline for them, and that was enough to silence her voice when her dignity was bruised. But deep inside, something was shifting. The years of silent suffering were carving strength in places she didn't yet know existed. And though she didn't realize it, the stage was being set. For soon, someone would arrive. It was on an ordinary morning, when the mansion's halls echoed with the clinking of silver trays and the hurried footsteps of servants that change first arrived. A new maid stepped through the towering doors, carrying not just a suitcase but a presence that seemed to fill the space around her. Unlike the others, she didn't shuffle nervously or bow her head too quickly. She moved with calm steadiness, her posture upright, her gaze clear. There was something unspoken in her eyes, a quiet fire that hinted she was not someone who would be easily broken. The billionaire's wife noticed it immediately. She stood on the staircase in a shimmering gown, studying the new arrival with the sharpness of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. For a brief moment, her lips curved into a smile, but it was not one of welcome. It was the smile of a predator recognizing a challenge. The staff exchanged quick glances. They had seen new workers come and go, most leaving within weeks under the pressure of the wife's demands. But this one felt different. There was a steadiness in her movements, a confidence in the way she greeted the others, as though she already understood the unspoken rules of the mansion and had no intention of being ruled by them. The first maid, weary and cautious, watched from the shadows. She had learned long ago that drawing attention was dangerous, yet something about the new maid caught her eye. Perhaps it was the way she treated every worker with respect, or the way she carried herself without fear. In a house where silence was survival, such fearlessness seemed impossible. From the very first day, small frictions began to appear. Where others lowered their heads, the new maid met the wife's gaze. Where others obeyed without hesitation, she paused just long enough to show that obedience was a choice, not a weakness. They were subtle acts, barely noticeable to outsiders, but to those who had lived under the wife's rule, they were sparks of rebellion. The air in the mansion grew heavier with each passing day. The wife, accustomed to unquestioned authority, felt a shift she could not ignore. The staff, caught between fear and curiosity, whispered that perhaps the new maid would not last. But a few dared to hope she might stay long enough to do what none of them had ever imagined. The mansion's rhythm carried on, but with the new maid in its halls, the air felt different. Where silence once blanketed the corridors, there was now a subtle hum of defiance, though few dared to acknowledge it openly. The billionaire's wife wasted no time in testing her new employee. Tasks grew heavier, demands sharper, as though she wanted to prove that even the strongest spirit could be bent beneath her will. Yet the new maid met every order with calm precision. She did not complain, nor did she flinch under the weight of scrutiny. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled the very woman who sought to break her. The first maid observed from a distance, her own hands busy with chores that had long worn grooves into her skin. At first, she worried for the newcomer. She knew too well the crushing weight of the wife's expectations and feared that anyone who resisted would be cast out swiftly, perhaps cruelly. But as days passed, something remarkable began to unfold. When the wife's temper flared, the new maid did not crumble. When others were blamed for mistakes they hadn't made, she stepped in to quietly help set things right. Small gestures, a tray lifted before it could fall, a word of comfort offered in hushed tones, began to weave a thread of trust between her and the weary maid who had endured in silence for so long. The staff noticed this unspoken bond forming. In stolen glances and whispered conversations, they admitted that the newcomer carried a strength none of them had dared to hold on to. Where the old maid embodied endurance, the new one embodied resistance, and together they became symbols of something greater than survival. They became a hint of hope. But hope in a place built on fear was dangerous. The wife grew increasingly restless, sensing that control was slipping. Her voice rose sharper, her punishments harsher, her eyes colder. Yet the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more obvious it became. Cracks were forming in the foundation of her power. The mansion, once a place where silence ruled, was beginning to stir, and though the storm had not yet broken, its winds were gathering strength. The night of the grand gala arrived, a spectacle that drew the wealthiest faces of the city into the mansion's glittering halls. Musicians filled the air with delicate strings, crystal glasses clinked with laughter, and the billionaire's wife glided through the room draped in jewels, her smile a mask of perfection. To the guests, she was untouchable, the embodiment of elegance and control. But behind the scenes, the staff scrambled frantically, their every step measured to ensure nothing went wrong. For in this house, even the smallest mistake could become a public humiliation. And that night, the tension was heavier than the chandeliers that sparkled overhead. The first maid, weary but determined, moved quickly with trays of wine, her hands steady despite the ache in her bones. The new maid worked nearby, her calm presence, a silent shield in a storm of orders and corrections. Yet it was during these moments of pressure that the wife's cruelty burned brightest. As the evening reached its peak, a small mishap occurred. A glass slipped, shattering against the marble floor, the sound echoing like a warning bell. Conversations halted, heads turned, and in that breathless pause, the wife seized her chance. She strode forward, her gown sweeping behind her, and all eyes followed. She singled out the first maid, accusing her with a cold glare sharp enough to cut through the silence.